Welcome to the Imaginaries.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Imaginaries, our first episode in 2018 that is not an awards podcast, when we're actually going to be returning to our regularly scheduled podcasting. And what a day it is, what an episode it is, because, let me tell you, some heinous shit has happened in 2018 already, and some really good shit too, but one of the most awful things that's happened so far is that we lost Ursula K. Guin. And on that note, welcome to the show. We want to give 45 minutes to the goddamn master herself. So, Ursula K.
Yes,
Guin is who we're talking about today.
And, of course, when people think of Ursula K. Le Guin, there's a couple specific texts which leap to mind. We're going to talk about some of those, but we're also going to talk about the larger role that she had to play in science fiction and in our development as readers and writers of science fiction. So, Tony, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I think it might actually be fun to share our stories about our introduction to her work and where we got our starts.
Sure. Where did you get yours?
Well, I got my start with Earthsea. When I was in high school, I was big into Harry Potter back then, and that was, I don't know, that must have been around the time, somewhere between like when the 4th and 5th Harry Potters came out. And I had shared them with a friend of my parents, and she liked Ursula K. Le Guin and had good old copies of Earthsea, and she enjoyed Potter, but wanted to give me what she had grown up with, what she remembered, and so I borrowed and actually never gave back her copies of Earthsea. I have them to this day. I actually just recently got a copy of all of the Earthsea books in one volume, I think. Now I'm looking at my shelf and I can't find it. Maybe it's on my other shelf. Anyway, so at that point, though, I had been exposed to a lot of like serialized science fiction, a lot of YA fantasy, and Earthsea was something different. And I want to say that I read it and it opened my eyes and suddenly nothing was the same. But really, when I first read it, I thought it was kind of boring. I didn't really like it. The writing style was very much felt very stilted and old to me at age 15 or 16 or whatever. And I read through them and then I put them down. And when I came back to them later, I was like, oh my God, these are amazing. The writing is so good. But it's one of those I'd like to say that wasn't my first encounter because it wasn't the kind of first encounter that I wanted to have. But I actually think that because I didn't like Earthsea originally, when I came back to Ursula Le Guin, I appreciated her all the more because I really, really liked what she was doing then. And then I, learned more about her role in the science fiction and fantasy communities and all the things that she had done and appreciated what I had really failed to appreciate previously.
Yeah, she's an author with so much range. She was an author with such range that when you look at her body of literature, you could start with any one of her books and then come back to her years later and read another one of her books and feel like you've encountered a completely different author.
Yes.
And you can even feel that way about the same book at different points in your life, of course.
Right.
But I feel like with Le Guin, when I started reading her too, I went through the Hainish cycle of books first, and there's a huge difference between Rocannon's World and The Dispossessed, for example.
Absolutely.
And reading those in close proximity to each other is sort of a nail-biting, gut-wrenching, whiplash-inducing experience.
Yes.
Tonally and on a lot of different levels. And I'm curious because I've only just read the first Earthsea book for the first time. When you were reading Earthsea and it was part of this larger ecosystem of fantasy books, what sort of what sort of a place did it come to occupy when you look at like the pantheon of science fiction and fantasy that was important to you as a kid?
Well, when I was a kid, I would say I kind of overlooked it entirely. Like, it would not have been part of that stable. But now, as a grown-up, and Earthsea is one of those series that not only transcends labels, but also has fun smashing them apart. Like, you can't really say that Earthsea is a YA fantasy series because that kind of like they didn't exist. Like, those labels didn't exist. I mean, absolutely they did, but it kind of, has fun playing with what it means to write for a certain age group and what those assumptions mean, what it means to write fantasy at all. Like, is it a fantastical story? Is it on par with, like, something like, say, Lord of the Rings, or is it something, almost mythological? Is it, like, a retelling? I don't want to say retelling exactly, but, like, does it have more in common with the Epic of Gilgamesh than it does with Harry Potter? And those are interesting questions to ask now, but I think, one of the reasons that I appreciate Ursula K. Le Guin now, and have for the past many years, is that she's someone who did, by virtue of just what she was doing and that she got away with what she was doing, the kind of stuff that we advocate for a lot when we talk about, getting rid of strict categories and opposing, what publishers have to do to organize certain books and whatnot. So, and that's not to say that was, easy, or that was the career that she chose. But she's just such, I mean, I loved the things that were flooding the internet, at least our part of the internet, in the days after her death, because I got to see a side of her that I had not seen before, like her letters to publishers, to other writers, to fans, and everything I saw, which granted has to be just a really limited, obviously. But everything I saw was so poised and so in control and so, I don't know, just, there's something about her that is unclockable, to use a drag phrase. But I mean, like, really, there's, you can't. Did she disagree with people? Yes, absolutely. Did she call out bullshit when she saw it? Oh, I now have a lot of evidence for that via my, like, Twitter feed and things. Do I have a lot of respect for her because she demanded it? Absolutely. So, that got way away from your question.
That's okay. That's the best kind. That's the best kind of answer. It really is. I think it gives us insight, not just into how you received her, but how that applies to how other people might receive her, and how she was intending herself to be received. And I think some of the unclockableness of her public profile might be due to the fact that she was thinking very early on about her place in the larger community of writers, and not just when she became prominent and a huge voice in science fiction, and a titan from a prior generation that people looked up to as a mentor. I mean, she was, from the very beginning, she was very conscious of herself in relation to others. That's very clear from some of her earlier speeches and awards acceptance, letters and things like that. And also from some of her, as you mentioned, her rejection letters and things that she would dole out over the years. Like, she respected everyone, but she didn't take bullshit from anyone. Yeah. And sometimes those two things might seem to be mutually exclusive or whatever. Yeah. But she made it work somehow. She was up to the end adapting and looking for new ways to communicate with her fellow writers and readers. So she got on Twitter in her later years, and it was this beautiful thing. She was great on social media and poised and put together. And yeah, there's a an Ursula K. Le Guin shaped hole in the social media world right now.
Yeah.
Um.
Yeah, there is. And, one of the things that I want to talk about today is her canon of work.
Yeah.
And I mention that now because right before she died, like less than a month before she died, she had a new collection of essays come out.
Yeah.
And what's interesting to me is that her canon, like what people remember, and I'm not sure exactly who I'm talking about when I say people. A part of it is definitely me, like what I'm aware of. But I think that there's some truth to this as well in terms of like what books have seen republication, what you tend to see on shelves for her. But there's been this real cultivation of certain of her ratings. You see Earthsea, you see The Dispossessed, you see The Lathe of Heaven, maybe a couple of others. You see stories like The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas being reprinted in story collections. There's a really great collection that I love called The Secret History of Science Fiction, which...
Hey! Sorry.
Which is...
That was not an appropriate reaction to hearing a familiar book.
Which is edited by... Sorry.
Because that is the anthology, Tony, that I found The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas in and sent you the introduction for on... Yeah, just a couple weeks ago. I was like, look at this cool thing I discovered, and all along you knew. This is crazy.
So... The funny aside there is that not only did I know about that, that's the book I taught when I was teaching freshman comp, the honors class.
I hate you so much right now.
But
Carry on.
I mentioned that to say that, while that short story is one that, won awards when it was published, has been republished since, it's included in a book like The Secret History of Science Fiction, and sees a fair bit of replay, but not as much as it ought to. All of which is to say, we have books like The Dispossessed, which is part of the Hainish cycle, but is far and away the most popular of the cycle, I think. Even more so than Lathe of Heaven, which is also part of the Hainish cycle, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, technically, I believe so.
So
yes,
but I mentioned this. I'm saying all of this to sort of reflect on what it means to be a prolific author who writes cross genre, and not just both science fiction and fantasy and like more literary fiction, but like does all kinds of fiction, does poetry, does essays, like has multiple books in those multiple genres, has a presence online where she writes. She just was so active in so many different writing communities. And I think it's important to acknowledge that and also sort of think about at the same time, what happens to all of that? Because obviously for most authors, for most anyone who makes a creative work, their everything they make is not going to be remembered for its merit, for its impact, for its artistic vision, for how it changed the field, etc., because not every work is going to do that. But I just find it so interesting now that we know, unfortunately, unless there's something coming posthumously, which would be amazing, now that we have seen the breadth of Ursula K. Le Guin's work, what we remember and what we don't remember, and what we think of and what we don't think of when we think of her. Like, I will tell you right now, for me, when I think Ursula K. Le Guin, it's immediately Ursy and it's The Dispossessed.
Sure.
To a lesser extent, it's Lathe of Heaven. And kind of overriding that is the knowledge that she was very prolific and wrote in many different genres, but not like the experience of coming to Ursula K. Le Guin because I really liked her essays, or I really liked her poetry, or like that, and it complemented her fantasy in whatever ways. So
I mean, but I think functionally speaking, I'm so grateful that authors like Ursula K. Le Guin, like setting aside all of the independent merit of her work, I'm so glad that authors like her exist.
Oh,
and
yes.
Chris Beckett too, where
Yes.
like I'll be running through a bookstore and like a used bookstore, and I'll find a copy of a Le Guin or a Beckett or something that I've never read and I've never even heard of. And like that ability to discover, after already falling in love with an author, to discover that there are layers and
Yeah.
additional texts squirreled away here and there throughout
Yes.
the and this is true for Octavia Butler too. And we've chosen to preserve and republish specific of these authors'
Yes.
works, and that holds true for Butler, Beckett, and Le Guin. But really, like, there's such a body of work that you can continue to discover and rediscover their respective writings again and
Right.
again and again. And that is, to me, mysterious and wonderful and beautiful and great. We're, like, in the modern age, we have a spreadsheet in which we're tracking,
Right.
like, all of the books that
Yep.
are coming out this year, which is great also. But it doesn't leave as much gray area languishing in the corners, in the shadows, for these secret, so quote-unquote, texts to
Right.
hide away in. And like J.K. Rowling, we know exactly how many books she's written. In
Right.
fact, she can't even write under a pseudonym without it being
Right.
found out in like 2 weeks
Yeah.
flat.
Yeah.
So there's nowhere to hide if you're a popular sci-fi author now.
Right.
And that's not really the case for authors who were starting to be published before the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so anyway, I would make a shout out to like all of those authors who have these bodies of work
Yeah.
that are not entirely beloved and republished and anthologized. And,
Yeah.
we'll always be finding more Ursula K. Le Guin, lecture notes or
Right.
speech notes or short stories
Yeah.
and things like that. And that's, to me, exciting. Like,
Yeah.
she's not dead. She's not dead yet because I haven't read all her books yet.
Right.
And I won't ever get there.
Yes, and that's totally fair. And I was actually going to go, I think, in that same direction, that it's kind of exciting to be able to walk into a used bookstore and find a new Ursula K. Le Guin book that you like didn't know existed. And maybe one might know her complete list of works and be looking for specifically like the ones that one has not read before. But I've definitely walked into like just one of the Bookmans in Tucson and been like, oh, I have never heard of that book before by her. And that is, that is its own kind of living. I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
That like, we are, again, unless we get a posthumous book, which would be amazing, and I hope that we do, we're not going to get a newly published book. But that doesn't mean with a writer like Ursula K. Le Guin, who is so prolific and wrote so many different things in so many different genres, that doesn't mean that we can't ever still go into a bookstore and find something new by her. And that is so lovely and so exciting.
Yeah.
And like such, a testament to her, how important she was and how important I hope she'll continue to be.
Yeah, and, I think we're at the very beginning stages of that long and agonizing process whereby people begin to mythologize the recently dead.
Yeah.
And I want to be honest about her work too.
Yeah.
And I want her work to be able to be honest for itself. Like, I know that a lot of the authors that we talk about on this podcast, especially ones who are golden age or older, we've gotten to a point where the mythology of the author has sort of eclipsed what actually hit the page.
Yeah. Right.
And for me, like, reading Le Guin was never a like perfectly joyous romp or I was always thinking about the text on the page when I was reading her. And unlike you, I didn't come to her with Earthsea when I was younger. I came to her with The Dispossessed after my first year of college. And after I read The Dispossessed while I was on painkillers for some surgery, I was like, this is awkward and uncomfortable, and I don't really get it. So I'm going to keep reading. And that was my response at the time was I'm going to get all of the Hainish cycle books and read them all in a week.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time we were in Florida and the Orlando library system is great. So I got all of her books in a week and read them while on painkillers. But there was something about like the meatiness of it that for me was enough for me to keep going. I was like, well, there's something here I don't quite get, but I'm getting enough that I know I want to keep going and I want to keep learning more. But it wasn't like her prose was transcendent or immersive even. Like I was always being pulled out of the text by things that I didn't agree with or that were uncomfortable. And I would stress too that these books came to me early in my self-identification journey. Like I was born into a conservative, evangelical, Christian, Republican voting, like, white family. And so I didn't even know that there was the possibility to envision different kinds of identity. And then I start reading Ursula K. Le Guin, and she was the first author to question gender that I read without putting the book down and being offended by. And so that's valuable, but I was trying to argue with her the whole time I was reading, and then by, I think, the end of my first read-through of the Hainish books, I was like, yeah, that's cool. But it wasn't like I was like, oh, this is magical, her sentences are sublime.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that that's worth noting, too. Like, what's powerful to me about Ursula K. Le Guin is not sentences so much as ideas.
Yes.
And in some ways, that makes a stark contrast to some of the books that we've, for example, voted award winners this year, where the sentences alone are, like, enough to put the book on our top 10 list.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think that science fiction, we've got to appreciate that you can have a book that's not, maybe a little rougher around the edges, and still is amazing and, in my case, life transforming. It gave me a vocabulary I didn't have before. It forced me to consider ideas that I hadn't before. And I wouldn't say that this book turned me queer by any stretch of the imagination. I was queer, and this book helped me figure out my relationship to the world around me in real life as I was encountering her complex social structures in the books. So, yeah, I wasn't like the kid who is encountering this magical world for the first time, which is kind of, it's what a lot of the obituaries and sort of grief notes about her passing sound like. So I don't know if I'm unusual in my relationship to Le Guin, but I mean, oh man, I miss her so much.
Yeah.
I miss her so much, but not in the way that maybe you do or other people do who came to her younger and without all of my baggage. Anyway, that was me ranting a lot.
Which is good. I wanted to hear that because I knew
like I feel like I'm being a downer about her work, but I'm not. I'm just down because she's gone.
No, I get it, and like because we could absolutely talk about, you know, how amazing she is and say nothing bad. But I mean, the reality is that both of us kind of had, you know, upon first contact, not great experiences with her. And that's important. And I don't know, I feel like it does her a disservice if we ignore that, and does her a real service if, you know, when we're honest about it and say, in my case, I did not feel like when I was a teenager and read Earthsea that I would ever want to pick them up again, and I was not losing anything by like having that one experience with her. So, you know, I did definitely read them when I was younger, but I feel like I actually didn't come to her work in a serious way until, you know, maybe like 5 years ago. Definitely within the last 10 years, because it took, for me, also The Dispossessed to really think there is something here that I've never encountered before, that I want more of, that is putting things in a way that feels much more real. And I think that, you know, in a lot of ways, not necessarily personal identity in the same way that you were struggling with, but I read The Dispossessed when I was starting to think about geography, which is my PhD, and I still don't know shit about geography, but the important thing is that, you know, it was at a time when I was surrounded by a lot of folks who who paid lip service to social justice, certainly. I think a lot of them were actually invested in it, but I was still trying to sort of figure out, like, who are these people? Like, what are they about? What does it mean to be, like, you know, kind of this closeted academic social justice person? And to come to The Dispossessed while dealing with that was to see this, you know, this grand thought experiment really played out in a way that actually really considered not this, you know, kind of starry-eyed view of what collective anarchism would look like, but rather what felt like a very honest view. And maybe that's kind of what we're doing in this podcast, subconsciously, or at least subconsciously for me. Like, what I think she was good at, in addition to many other things, was to take really honest looks at how shitty things were. And that's, you know, one of the reasons why we continue to like Octavia Butler, which we've talked about on here before. But with Ursula K. Le Guin, it just, the topics that she took on just range so far. I mean, you know, you have the politics of anarchy and The Dispossessed, you have gender and The Lathe of Heaven, you have, I don't even know what you would say for, like, those who walk away from Omelas, like, power differential in society, something like that. Certainly, you know, and the other thing is that there's so much criticism about her work. Yeah. Like, I'm sure that, you know, you could read pages upon pages of things and about what each of these works, you know, is tackling in society as far as societal ills go, but having that honesty, having her honesty in a way that maybe I don't know that certainly we have it from other authors. I don't want to pretend like, you know, oh, in the good old days, like Ursula K. Le Guin was the only one who's ever done this. Like, no, we definitely have this. We have a lot more of it, and I appreciate it. But Ursula K. Le Guin, I still think stands apart from everyone else in terms of what she would do and the way she would do it.
And I also think, and one of the points that's kind of been breaking through a little bit from what you've been saying is that she was always very earnest and sincere.
Yes.
And her science fiction takes itself seriously and takes its assumptions about reality to the utmost in terms of seriousness. Like, Omelas doesn't ever crack and then pull away and give you a chance to kind of giggle. Oh, yeah, you know, that's what disillusionment's like. Yeah. You know, like, it doesn't let you do that. And it also, in The Dispossessed and The Left Hand of Darkness and these other ambiguous utopias, as they put it, as she put it, she never did that. Like, her worlds were entire. Once you were in them, you were in them.
Yeah.
And there was no breaking away. And it wasn't just that she was unflinching in looking at these realities that she created. She required you to buy in. Mm-hmm. And she honestly didn't really care so much if you bought in or not. Like, if you didn't buy in, that's fine. There were other works out there for you to read.
Right.
But if you were going to read an Ursula K. Le Guin, like, you had to say, okay, I'm in it, and I'm going to consider the assumptions that you're laying forth. I'm going to consider the plot points you're laying forth with the earnestness and sincerity that you're asking for.
Yeah.
And a lot of people turn away from these books because they're like, well, it was too dry or dull or dense or whatever. Especially like the Hainish cycle books. Mm-hmm. But I didn't ever take it as dry or dull or dense. I took it as serious and not prone to those breakaway craft moves that we often are taught in our MFA courses as like a way to pace the reader or provide breathing room or give another perspective. And I really respect that. For other authors, it may not work. For her, it it was great.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, great is maybe an understatement. It was what allowed me to be changed by her book.
Mm-hmm.
Her books, like especially The Dispossessed,
Yeah.
the first one that I read.
Yes.
I may not have liked it very much the first time through, but I never didn't take it seriously, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like she earned it. Like
Yeah.
she earned the right to be taken seriously.
Yeah.
On every level.
Yeah, and you used the word earnest a few minutes ago, and I want to agree with that. Like, there is an earnestness in everything that she does, or everything that she wrote, and maybe that's what not sets her apart from, like, everyone again, but, like, you know, is an integral component of how her works have lasted. I think we see a lot of meta commentary, a lot of irony in more recent books, and that gets hated on a lot, and I don't want to hate on it because I love it. But there isn't a lot of that in her books. There is this, you know, we might even call it, if the books were coming out today, like, you know, they might even seem to be too saccharine, too earnest, too, you know, too serious about themselves, in a way that, you know, gets applied to, for example, movies, especially comic book movies, that, like, take themselves so seriously and are really all about that grim dark thing. And that I actually do have a problem with, but that's its own kind of tangent. But because, I don't know, like, you know, it seems kind of like this podcast is, me at least, I don't know about how you feel, but trying to figure out, like, you know, what is it about her works, like, what really runs through a lot of the works that have stuck with me that sets her apart, that makes her memorable, that makes her an important part of my personal canon. And I think that earnestness is certainly one aspect of it, for sure.
Yeah, and it might also be perspective. Like, we're looking down the long barrel of a lifetime of work in her case.
Right.
And so from the first time that we ever encountered her, we're young enough, and we came to her late enough, at least to her adult books, that, I mean, there was the weight of that body of literature that we were talking about earlier behind her already by the time that we encountered her.
Yeah.
And a lot of the authors that we love for different reasons today, like I'm thinking N.K. Jemisin, Nnedi Okorafor, you know, all of the authors who we've spoken highly of on this podcast, they're closer to the beginning of their body of work. Like, they do have substantial works out there. In the case of N.K. Jemisin, she's got at least 2 complete series that are substantial. And Nnedi is, like, working on 4 series simultaneously. I don't know how she does it. But they're closer to the beginning of their arc. They may eventually have that body of work. Like, right. I'm wondering if we're going to have the same perspective on their works when we're, like, all, you know, 80, 90 together.
Right.
that we now have the benefit of seeing earlier in life about, you know, Ursula K. Le Guin. Like, we have the benefit of having come as young writers ourselves in at the end of her story.
Right.
You know, and benefiting from the full body of her work. We're growing alongside and reading alongside these other authors as they publish.
Right.
And it's a different experience, but hey, who's to say in another 60 years we're not going to look back, hopefully we live another 60 years, and in 60 years we're not going to look back and feel the same way about, like, Nnedi and N.K. Jemisin that Le Guin's contemporaries feel about her. Like, I wonder what it must be like to be inside of Margaret Atwood's head, thinking about Le Guin's passing, for example.
Right.
Yeah.
And I also feel lucky, now that you're mentioning some other authors who we respect a lot, who are, you know, more towards the, I don't want to say, again, the beginning of their careers, but, you know, have a few books out. We like them a lot. They, you know, they've had series. But I'm thinking, too, of authors who we didn't get to enjoy for as long as Ursula K. Le Guin. People like Octavia Butler or Ian M. Banks, who unfortunately died younger than Ursula K. Le Guin. In Octavia Butler's case, much sooner much sooner than she should have. And in Banks's case, again, much sooner than he should have. And, you know, for those authors, we do have substantial bodies of work, but we could have had decades more. And that's really disappointing. And so to have someone like Ursula K. Le Guin, who lived what seemed like from the outside, you know, a really full life and produced as a writer a lot of writing, a lot of books, a lot of poems, a lot of essays, a lot of collections. I feel really lucky that we got that. And, you know, we did come to her late. We've only been alive for, I mean, basically she was probably, you know, past the, I hate to like think of her career as a bell curve, but you know, certainly Earthsea and Dispossessed and Lathe of Heaven had already been published before we were even born. So you know, she was very much established by the time that we came around, and certainly by the time that we discovered her books.
I wonder, were there new challenges to that writing in that world where it's so different from the one that she started publishing in? And was it easier? Was it harder? Was it draining of creativity, or was it infusing of a different kind of creativity? Right. And that's, and again, I think that's one of the reasons, one of the many aspects of her work that, you know, helps to sustain that work through the years. Like, you use gender as something that I think she was very well known for, you know, in all of her work. But when I think of Earthsea and me coming back to it, like the entire cast in Earthsea were people of color, and it was one of those things that resonated so strongly, given, you know, the furor that still is not going to end anytime soon over, like, you know, fantasy realms, and how if there's not a person of color who's like directly called out as such, like they're by default white, and like how people don't have problems with that. And I don't know, just she was so ahead of her time. So very ahead of her time in so many ways. And the frustrating thing about that is that it's easy to kind of look back and say she was ahead of her time, but the reality was she was exactly in her time and was doing just what she was doing at that time. It's just everyone else kind of hadn't caught up, but it didn't stop her, and it didn't stop her from being popular, winning awards, like being recognized for those things, and that is amazing. She had a reputation for taking the genre seriously, and she refused to let anyone not take her seriously in real life as an author, as well as in her books, which we've talked about at length already. You know, and that's one of the things I admire so much about her, is that, you know, she didn't run afoul of a bunch of people, specifically. Like, she didn't deliberately pick fights when she didn't need to, but, you know, you always got a sense that she knew what she was about. Yeah. And you couldn't bullshit around her. And it, whether it's ancient bullshit or contemporary bullshit, like all of it was kind of one and the same to her, in that, like, she had the ability to see humanity for what it could be, which is timeless, not as it is, which is temporary. And so a lot of what she gets into with her books, like whether it's anarchist philosophy or social engineering, or, you know, whatever it is, like it tends to get at some of these more timeless things. And again, like, not with transcendently gorgeous language or whatever, but in a way that forced you to also look at the timeless elements of what works and what doesn't work, and what changes you and doesn't change you. And and I think of Omelas, the ones who walk away from Omelas, as a great example of that. And we were debating earlier, like, what is it about this story? Really. And you teach it in a classroom environment, and I imagine then you have like 20 kids all going, what is it about this story?
But what's interesting about that is that, from what I remember in that class, and, you know, this was several years ago now, this was, 2013, I think, 2013, 2014. But the authors that people really resonated with, the ones that tended to get the most responses, the ones who tended to get the most thoughtful responses, she was one of them. Omelas was one of them. And Octavia Butler was also in there. And I know there were a couple of others as well. But just, these things have, and by these things, I mean the stories themselves, they have staying power for the, probably many of the reasons that we've talked about already. But they stay, and they're there, and they're good, and we like them, and we will forever read them. And pass them on. And really, I think of something that our friend Katie said, which is that even if you're a really famous author, like Ursula K. Le Guin, the canon is made by what people read and what people use. And the fact that, I used The Secret History of Science Fiction in a class that I taught, the fact that they included that short story in that collection. And I actually used it, I only used that book one semester, and I used The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas in the previous semester just as like a standalone short story. The fact that that was there in circulation, that these folks who were 18, most of them, taking this class, who hadn't heard of her before, who hadn't read this story before, were then exposed to it. I'm using that as a very small example, but like that kind of stuff matters. And the propagation of her work, of someone like Ursula K. Le Guin, who, from the time she's no longer with us, continues to matter, is up to the people who remember her and continue to read her and pass her on.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this segues with a possible future sci-fi podcast that we've been considering for a while, which is the collector's impulse, like what goes into crafting an anthology and editing an anthology or a collection of other people's stories. And The Secret History of Science Fiction, for those of you who have not yet Googled this for yourselves, is edited by James Patrick Kelly and John Kessel, and both of them are like staples of the anthology circuit. So when you look at the anthology collection in your local Barnes and Noble, for example, because that's what I think of as like the, where books go when they've been agreed upon by everyone, as I don't know, like the Wikipedia page of science fiction is what ends up in Barnes and Noble. Yeah. And so, like, when you look at that section, you have, like, at least 6 or 7 different anthologies put together by Kelly, several by John Kessel, some that are partnerships. And then you also have now, the rising star of the anthology market is the Vandermeer clan. I'm going to call them a clan. But Anne and Jeff Vandermeer, and they are specifically given over to weird sci-fi, but they also are, putting together some other anthologies that are not specific to, like, weird in science fiction. And so, like, what goes into collecting these works, and like, how do you decide what's a banner work or what's worth preserving or what's like a quote-unquote secret work that needs to be made less secret?
Yeah.
And, like, that's very, very interesting. And I think that anthologizers are going to be debating over various Le Guin works for a long time. Like, do we preserve this element of her canon, or do we preserve that element,
right,
or do we try to uncover something that's been mostly forgotten, or, and again, this comes full circle back to the breadth of her work.
Yeah. It's
a real testament to her staying power, her diversity of thought, her diversity of style, that this is going to be a quote-unquote problem for anthologizers for a long time. And it'll be interesting to see what, her legacy gets dumbed down to.
Right.
20 years.
Yeah, it will be. To sort of like, revisit this podcast. I mean, not even necessarily listening to ourselves talk, but just think about, how we remember Ursula K. Le Guin less than a month after she died versus, how we remember her in a year, 5 years, 10 years. Like, what happens to her legacy, what it becomes. So yeah, for sure. I guess we'll just have to, keep reading her, keep passing her on, and see what happens. So on that note, all I will say for my final thought is read Ursula K. Le Guin.
Yes, definitely. And that latest work or collection of hers, No Time to Spare,
Yeah.
Thinking About What Matters, that's on my to-read list for the year.
Yeah, me too.
And it's made a lot of people's to-read lists. So I think one of the great... one of the great ironies, perhaps, of her passing is that she had she had this book called No Time to Spare that she put out in the last year of her life. And of course, like, books take a while to get published, so technically she finished this a while ago.
Of course.
But, like, the last book that she released was reflective and seems to, in some ways, at least from its reputation, since I haven't read it yet, to kind of sum up a lot of her larger thoughts about science fiction and the craft of writing. So I very much look forward to hearing, like, the author's final words on the subject, and the subject is her. So, hang around. There will be more Le Guin thoughts informing future discussions.
For sure.
Now that we're back into her. So, yeah, there's a lot more Le Guin love to go around. And if it sounds a little bit like this was a downer of an episode, I feel rejuvenated in a sense, like reinfused with a desire to read more Le Guin. Go back to some of those early texts which were problematic for me and caused me such... it sparked such change in my life when I was, oh my goodness, it's been over a decade. I'm so old. Oh, God. And I'm not even that old, but I feel super old. So what do we have coming up?
We've already been reading a lot of books in 2018. We've already been seeing some of what 2018 has to offer in terms of TV shows and movies. We both saw Black Panther last weekend. We watched the second half of the first season of Star Trek Discovery. So already,
I miss it so much.
Lots of good things in print and on screen. So we'll be definitely coming to you with more of those in future weeks.
Yes, we will. And we also update our books that we're currently reading and books that we hope to read soon on our website, which you can find at Imaginaries.net. And you can also find us, of course, on Twitter at Imaginary_pod, on SoundCloud and iTunes. Just Google the Imaginaries podcast, science fiction, and you will find what you need. Please feel free to follow us. We encourage you politely to follow us on social media, and throw us your recommendations. We have a full roster of books that we aim to read, but we really appreciate direction and insight from our readers and listeners, our fellow readers and listeners, because there's so many out there. It's great to have a little bit of momentum pointing at one text over the others, for example. And anything that I've missed, Tony, in terms of where you can find us?
You got it all.
So I think I would like to leave everyone with an Ursula K. Le Guin quote.
Excellent.
For today. And this is from The Secret History of Science Fiction. And it goes, "At this point, realism is perhaps the least adequate means of understanding or portraying the incredible realities of our existence. A scientist who creates a monster in his laboratory, a librarian in the Library of Babel, a wizard unable to cast a spell, a spaceship having trouble in getting to Alpha Centauri, all these may be precise and profound metaphors of the human condition. The fantasist, whether he uses the ancient archetypes of myth and legend or the younger ones of science and technology, may be talking as seriously as any sociologist, and a great deal more directly, about human life as it is lived, and as it might be lived, and as it ought to be lived."